cunning, deceptive, witty, and smart. If I told you that these adjectives were used to describe a character in the Sherlock Holmes series, you'd probably think of Holmes himself with no hesitation, right? But if I were to tell you that these adjectives were used to describe a female character in the series, accepting that would be a little bit harder. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jennifer Benavides, and today I will be doing my research project on A Deception in the Portrayal of Female Strength, a comparative analysis on femininity's impact on heteronormativity in the Sherlock Holmes series. So through this multi-layered analysis, I will be answering the research question of what is the transitional impact from a Victorian literary work to a modernized TV adaptation on issues of female empowerment when faced with heteronormativity? But first, I will give a brief overview of my project. So, as I just did, I read my research question, then I will move along to my literary piece summary and analysis, then my critical theory application, my contemporary application, and then finally the significance. So, my literature piece summary and analysis. So, the two literary pieces that I selected were Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's A Scandal in Bohemia and The Speckled Band, which are both literary novels from his Sherlock Holmes series. So in A Scandal in Bohemia, it features the notorious Irene Adler, also referred to as the Woman. Sherlock and Watson are called upon by the King of Bohemia to retrieve scandalous photos of himself and Adler. And just throughout the case, after cleverly being one step ahead of the deceptive Mr. Holmes, Adler ends up defeating Sherlock in a surprising plot twist, something that's never happened in the Sherlock Holmes series. And then in The Speckled Band, which follows the line of a more traditional Sherlock Holmes case, the mysterious case comes from a shaken Helen Stoner, whose late twin sister was recently suspected to be murdered, and all that was left, or the last thing that she said, was the Speckled Band. And after a long overnight stakeout and deception, the Speckled Band is revealed to be a highly venomous breed of snake, which is controlled by Dr. Roylott, who is Helen Stoner's stepdad. Within these two well-known stories are two drastically different female characters, leading me to develop my theme statement of masculinity is often defined by femininity. Cases in which that femininity falls out of heteronormative standards are regarded as exceptions, thus allowing me to acknowledge several literary devices of interpretation within those two novels. But for this analysis, I will examine the descriptions of female characters as well as the relationship between male and female characters. So, the descriptions of female characters. Within A Scandal Bohemia and The Speckled Band, these are the couple of quotes that I selected. In his eyes, she eclipses and predominates the whole of her sex. This is a phrase that's not typically denoted to just any female character in Conan Doyle's literary work, as well as she has a soul of steel. She has the face of the most beautiful of women and the mind of the most resolute of men. Despite retaining her femininity, this aspect of masculinity in a woman is typically unheard of in Victorian women, which is exemplified in The Speckled Band with Miss Helen Stoner. Her features and figure were those of a woman of 30, but her hair was shot with a premature gray, and her expression was weary and haggard. As you can see, in comparison, the descriptions are quite stark, one full of power, and the other not so quite. And so now we move along to the relationship between male and female characters. Despite the previous quote on Adler being powerful, these two quotes exemplify how Holmes pushes his dominating masculinity over the reliant feminine nature. So in The Scandal Bohemia, when a woman thinks that her house is on fire, her instinct is at once to rush to the thing which she values most, and I have more than once taken advantage of it. And then, it is very essential, Miss Stoner, that you should absolutely follow my advice in every respect. Your life may depend upon your compliance. So to further examine these heteronormative dynamics within the Sherlock series, an analysis and application of critical theories on my selected literary works were applied. The two pieces I selected were Pascal Crumb's A Scandal in Bohemia and Sherlock Holmes' Ultimate Mysteries Unsolved, and Courtner Jasper's Sherlock Holmes and the Failure of Masculine Values. Both of which the main focus was on Irene Adler in A Scandal in Bohemia, generally discussing the themes of gender roles in the Holmes series, the implications of shifts in these roles to power dynamics, and the overall correlation of that to Holmes' success. Through which I derived the shared criteria of psychological masculinity being defined by femininity and female otherness. So first is the psychological masculinity. Both came across the same consensus of how Holmes' masculinity is impacted by femininity, with Crumbs more so highlighting the detriment of it to his success, whereas Jasper is highlighting Holmes's thriving through his apparent knowledge of female nature, which you can see through the quotes that I selected. The trauma and impact of that failure are so great on Holmes that years later he still cannot bring himself to refer to Adler by name, calling her the woman instead. And then in Jasper's, Holmes confidently and gladly explains to Watson, this marriage rather simplifies matters. Eventually she is a woman like any other, and it is this stereotypical thinking that helps Holmes to solve the problem. In my application to the foundational text, I focused more so on Crumbs' theory by examining the impact of his failure to a woman that forces him to call Adler the woman, which in comparison to Helen Stoner, who is constantly referred to as Madam. And in the Scandal Bohemia, Adler is referred to as Madam only once, and not even by Holmes himself. Next is female otherness. Again, both critical theories come to the same consensus that Adler is regarded as other due to her foreignness from the typical Victorian woman, which could lead to explanation of Holmes's shocking defeat by Adler. And so the two quotes I have selected were born in New Jersey in the year 1858, contralto, La Scala, prima donna, Imperial Opera of Warsaw, yes, retired from operatic stage, living in London, quite so. In comparison to, I am living with my stepfather, who was the last survivor of one of the oldest Saxon families in England. Through the comparison of exception between Adler and Stoner, it's evident that the traits of otherness, such as through nationality and mindset, allow for exceptions in the masculinity, or lack of, that Holmes displays in these novels. And so with the understanding of those foundational and critical theory texts, which overall examines the concepts of male and female relationships in the Victorian era, understanding whether or not these concepts translate from generation to generation can be understood through a contemporary application. And so the contemporary piece I selected was BBC Sherlock's A Scandal in Belgravia, which is the TV adaptation of Conan Doyle's A Scandal in Bohemia. And a brief summary of it is Sherlock and Watson are set on a mysterious blackmail case. They must retrieve scandalous photographs for a high-positioned individual, which were taken by Irene Adler. Instances involving international terrorism, rogue CIA agents, and a secret conspiracy involving the British government rise up. And overall, the threat of the woman, who proves to be just as cunning, clever, and deceptive as Holmes himself. My justification for choosing this contemporary piece largely lies at the fact that it's the direct adaptation of the foundational text, or one of them, therefore opening the big question on whether or not the previous concepts examined will be applicable towards the newer version. So, examining the foundational text to the contemporary piece, I first examined the descriptions of the female characters. And in the I have my quotes from the previous adaptations, or examinations of the descriptions of female characters, and in the BBC adaptation, Irene Adler is described as a lesbian dominatrix that actually refers to herself as the woman, rather than being given the title, which differs from the original text and questions the power dynamic between the male and female relationships that were found in the foundational text. And to continue with relationships, again, Holmes is able to portray his dominance on Adler, despite her having bested him at several points, which is proven as quoted. "I've always assumed love is a dangerous disadvantage. Thank you for the final proof." Holmes practically shoves in our face how male's logical mind will always succeed over the female's emotional mind. Lastly, for the critical theory application, I focused more on Crumb's interpretation of the criteria. And so we have the psychological masculinity defined by femininity. Adler's less than typical occupation and equally as cunning cleverness gives Holmes reason to place her in a category outside of his stereotypical mind frame. A quote from BBC Sherlock's Scandal Belgravia, "Because I took your post, elevated, your pupils dilated," basically signifying how he was able to understand that she fell in love with him, which is, again, that, and as a result, she lost to Holmes, which, again, is that male's logical mind over the female's emotional mind, as well as the criteria of female otherness. In the BBC adaptation, Adler is no longer American or an opera singer. Instead, she's English and a dominatrix in the television adaptation, which, in comparison to A Scandal Bohemia, makes a way to believe how Adler's otherness factors led to her success, since when stripped of them in the TV adaptation, she lost to Holmes. So overall, from the original canon works to the TV adaptations, there leaves no questions of the cultural impact of the Sherlock Holmes series. However, whether or not it left an impact on the issue of female empowerment and accurate representation of such raises another question that I answered today, leading me to my two implications. First is my feminist implication. And through a feminist lens, the transition from a slightly empowered woman in the Victorian era to a diminishment of empowerment altogether in the modern adaptation displays the lack of progression in gender equality, all of which is hidden within subliminal heteronormative actions that gets portrayed as strength for women. Thus connecting me to my pop culture implication, which is the lack of accurate representation in the male-dominated media, despite having equally as many female fans. And so I will leave you on this quote from no other than Holmes himself, that "It's elementary, my dear Watson. But the issue regarding female empowerment and heteronormative scales with famous pieces of literature and adaptations of such isn't so elementary, and is a case that needs to be solved." Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please ask. And these are my works cited.